The pumpkin sat in a bed of the wagon, like a fallen sun. It was not merely large, it was a celestial body brought to earth, its skin a deep, burnished orange that seemed to hold the light of 100 autumn sunsets. Its stem was as thick as a man's forearm, gnarled and woody, a testament to the life that had poured into it. The townsfolk of Dustfall stood in a silent ring around the wagon, their mockery of the past 2 years curdled into a thick, unpalatable awe. Men who had laughed at her, who had tapped their heads when her name was mentioned, now took off their hats as if in the presence of a miracle. Women who had whispered pitying remarks behind their hands now stared with a hunger that was about more than just food. Silas Croft, the grain dealer whose word had been the town's gospel, stood stiffly at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of pinched disbelief. His own fields, the pride of the county, were cracked and barren under the relentless sun, his corn withered to rattling skeletons. And here, in the center of it all, was the thing he had declared impossible, grown from the soil he had pronounced dead. Ilara stood beside the wagon, her hands resting on the warm curve of the pumpkin. She was not smiling, she was not gloating. Her face was calm, her posture still, as if she were merely presenting a fact. A thing's only worth what others will pay, the town's wisdom went. But Ilara knew better. A thing's worth was what it could do. And this pumpkin, this impossible gourd, could feed a family for a week. There were 24 more like it, hidden behind a screen of willows in a basin of land everyone had forgotten. She met Croft's gaze across the silent square. It was not triumph she felt, but a quiet, solid certainty, heavy and real as the pumpkin beneath her hand. It was the certainty of a thing proven. The crowd parted as a small boy, Finn, pushed his way through, his face smudged with dirt and alight with fierce pride. He reached up and patted the pumpkin, his Goliath, as if reassuring an old friend. The silence was finally broken by the blacksmith, a man whose laughter had been the loudest. He cleared his throat. What do you want for it, miss?" he asked, his voice rough with a new and unfamiliar respect. Ilara looked not at him, but at the ring of drawn, hungry faces. She was just one person alone, they had always said. But one person alone had done this. 2 springs earlier, she had been a fool. That was the town's unanimous verdict, delivered without trial. Ilara had arrived in Dustfall on a tired horse with 2 canvas sacks and a small, heavy wooden chest that held all she owned. She was young, quiet, and possessed a stillness that the boisterous, worried town found unsettling. She bought the old mill property, 5 acres of land that hugged a bend in the creek downstream from the played-out silver mine. The purchase itself was cause for laughter. The mill had shut down 30 years ago, not for lack of water, but for lack of hope. The tailings from the mine had bled into the soil for a generation, leaving it a slick, gray pan that baked to the hardness of slate in the summer and turned to a foul-smelling grout in the rain. Nothing grew there but bitterweed and a species of stunted, grayish thistle. The deed cost her almost nothing, which the townsfolk took as proof of its worth. Silas Croft had approached her the day she signed the papers at the county office. He was a man built of soft, prosperous angles, his waistcoat straining slightly over a comfortable belly. He'd removed his hat, a gesture of condescension rather than respect. "A young woman alone," he'd begun, his tone dripping with false concern, "could not be expected to know the nature of this land. You've been cheated, I'm afraid. That soil died when the mill shut down. It's poisoned." Ilara had simply looked at him, her gaze level. "Soil doesn't die, Mr. Croft. It just gets tired." He'd chuckled, a soft, rumbling sound. "My dear girl, I've farmed this valley for 40 years. I know soil. And that," he said, gesturing with his hat toward the creek, is a graveyard. You'd have done better to sleep in the street. She did not argue. Being right is its own kind of reply, and she was not yet right. She was only hopeful. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the western ridges, she walked her graveyard. The land was as they'd said. It felt dead under her boots, yielding nothing. The air smelled of metal and decay. But she did not look at the wide, barren flats. She walked the edges, her eyes scanning the contours of the land. Down in a low-lying basin, screened from the road by a thicket of willows and cottonwoods, the ground was different. It was still gray, still sad, but it was damp. Water collected here. The bitterweeds grew thicker, a slightly healthier shade of green. She knelt and dug her fingers into the earth. It was cold, dense, and smelled sour, but it was not stone. It was a beginning, a place to work. She spent the first weeks not with a plow, but with a shovel and a wheelbarrow. She ignored the flat, hopeless expanse of the old mill yard and focused entirely on the hidden basin, an area no larger than a good-sized living room. The townsfolk, riding past on the main road, would sometimes see her, a lone figure in the distance, digging in the gray mud. They called her the Mud Girl. They said the grief of whatever had sent her here had finally cracked her mind. Alara heard the whispers when she went to town for supplies, the poorly veiled pity, the smirks. She met them with the same stillness she had shown Silas Croft, a quiet that seemed to absorb their mockery without reaction. It infuriated them. Her work was methodical, a penance and a prayer. Each morning before dawn, she would take her wheelbarrow and walk the 2 miles up to the edge of the woods, where the land had never felt the touch of the mine. There, she would dig up rich black leaf mold, the product of 1,000 autumns. It was heavy, fragrant work. She would wheel the precious cargo back to her basin and spread it over the sour gray soil. Then she would walk down to the creek, to the bends where centuries of floods had deposited banks of dark, clean silt. She shoveled the silt into her wheelbarrow, her muscles screaming, and hauled it up to the basin, mixing it with the leaf mold. Day after day after day, the slow alchemy continued. Black earth over gray, river silt over mine tailings. One afternoon, an old man stopped on the road. He didn't watch her from a distance. He walked right down the slope to where she worked. He was stooped and weathered, his face a road map of wrinkles, his accent thick with the cadence of a country left long behind. It was Old Man Hemlock, who lived in a small cabin upstream and was considered only slightly less peculiar than Alara herself. He watched her for a long time as she worked the new soil with a pitchfork, turning it over and over. "They say you are planting mud pies," he said, his voice a dry rustle. Alara paused, leaning on her pitchfork. "The pies aren't done yet." He grunted, a sound of approval. He bent down, with some difficulty, and picked up a clump of the amended earth. He crumbled it in his gnarled fingers, smelling it like a baker would smell his starter. "Is good," he said, "but is hungry. It needs fire." He pointed a shaky finger toward the livery stable in the distant town. "The horses, the cows, they make fire. You bring it here." He looked from the basin to the barren flats around it, then back to her. His pale blue eyes were surprisingly sharp. "The land does not forget what it is," he said, the words slow and deliberate, an aphorism delivered as truth. "It only forgets what men have told it to be. This land, it thinks it is poison. You must remind it that it is soil." He nodded once, a gesture of complete understanding, and shuffled away without another word. That afternoon, Ilara went to the liveryman and made a deal. She would muck out his stalls for free if she could keep the manure. The man laughed until he had to brace himself against a post. He agreed instantly. The mockery in town found a new focus. She was not just the mud girl. She was the manure girl. It did not matter. She had what she needed. She began to build a compost heap in the corner of the basin, layering the rich manure with dry weeds, kitchen scraps, and the gray, sour earth she had scraped away. She was reminding the land what it was. It was slow, back-breaking, and deeply hopeful work. She was not farming a field. She was healing a wound, one shovelful at a time. The world saw a fool. Ilara saw the arithmetic of resurrection. So much black dirt plus so much river silt plus so much stable fire turned and watered and rested would equal life. She staked everything on that simple, brutal equation. By June, the compost pile was a miracle of its own, steaming in the cool mornings, alive with the heat of its own making. It had shrunk to a third of its original size, and what remained was a dark, crumbly humus that smelled of the forest floor after a rain. It was the color of possibility. It was then that the boy appeared. His name was Finn. He was perhaps 10 years old, with a shock of unruly brown hair and eyes that missed nothing. His father was a tenant farmer on one of Croft's properties, a man perpetually shadowed by debt and worry. Finn was supposed to be helping his father, but he was drawn to the quiet, strange work happening on the shunned land. He would sit on the edge of the basin for hours, watching Ilara as she turned the compost, as she spread the finished humus over her prepared patch, working it deep into the soil she had built. He never spoke. Ilara never spoke to him. They existed in a shared silence, two solitary beings finding a strange companionship in the dirt. One day he approached her, holding out a rusty can. Inside were a dozen fat, wriggling earthworms. "Mr. Hemlock said the soil needed life," he mumbled, not looking at her. "These are alive." Ilara stopped her work. She looked at the worms, then at the boy's dirt-stained hands. She nodded gravely. "Thank you," she said. "It does." She gently tipped the worms onto the dark soil, and they immediately began to burrow out of sight. It felt like a benediction. From then on, Finn was no longer just a watcher. He became her partner. He was small, but he was wiry and tireless. He helped her haul buckets of water from the creek. He pulled the stubborn thistles that tried to invade their sanctuary. He brought her things. Bird feathers, interesting rocks, and always more worms. He never asked what she was doing. He seemed to understand that the work itself was the answer. By the 3rd week of June, the patch was ready. The soil was a foot deep, black and rich, a living island in a sea of gray sterility. That evening, as twilight softened the edges of the world, Ilara opened her small wooden chest. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, were seeds. They were larger than any pumpkin seeds Finn had ever seen, pale and fat, with a faint, almost luminous sheen. They were her only inheritance, passed down from a grandfather who had believed a pumpkin could be a work of art. She told no one where they came from. They were a secret she had carried for 1,000 miles. She and Finn planted them with the reverence of a sacrament. They pressed each seed into the dark earth, 3 to a mound, and covered them gently. They watered them from the creek, and then they waited. The arithmetic of survival shifted. It was no longer about building, but about hoping. Ilara would lie awake in her small, drafty cabin, which had once been the mill's office, and count. 10 mounds, 3 seeds per mound. If half sprouted, she would have 15 vines. If each vine produced even one good pumpkin, she would have enough to eat, enough to prove the land was not dead. It was a fragile, desperate calculation made in the dark. The town continued its life, oblivious. Silas Croft rode by on his fine black horse, surveying his own sprawling fields of sprouting corn. And sometimes he would glance toward the willows and permit himself a small, satisfied smile at the thought of the foolish woman wasting her life on his county's deadest dirt. He did not see the 2 figures who knelt by the mounds each morning, watching for the first sign. It was Finn who saw it first. A tiny arch of green, so pale it was almost white, pushing its way through the black soil. He didn't shout. He simply touched Ilara's arm and pointed. A single sprout. The next day, there were 5. By the end of the week, every mound had at least 2 strong seedlings breaking through. It had worked. The secret was kept like a coal banked low under ash, a hidden warmth that no one else could feel. The summer unfurled, hot and dry. In Croft's fields, the corn grew tall, but the stalks were thin. The rains that usually came in July held back, and the creek began to shrink away from its banks. But in Ilara's hidden basin, the vines thrived. Sheltered by the willows, rooted in the deep, spongy soil she had made, they seemed to be drinking from a different source altogether. The leaves were enormous, great green hands that shaded the earth beneath them, preserving the precious moisture. Ilara and Finn mulched them with straw, creating another layer of protection. The town saw only the parching fields and the dust that rose from the roads. They saw nothing of the riot of green life unfolding in the basin. In early July, the first flowers appeared, brilliant yellow blossoms like trumpets heralding a king. The air in the basin filled with the drowsy hum of bees, drawn from miles away to this unlikely oasis. Soon, the flowers withered, and at their base, tiny pale green spheres began to form. They were no bigger than marbles. Ilara watched them with a fierce, protective tenderness. She thinned the vines, choosing only the strongest 1 or 2 pumpkins on each, channeling all the plant's energy into them. It was another kind of arithmetic, the math of sacrifice. To get one great thing, you had to give up 10 lesser ones. Finn, who had never seen anything grow with such vigor, was mesmerized. He gave them names. The one closest to the creek was River King. A perfectly round one was Moon. And the one that had sprouted first, that seemed to swell visibly day by day, he called Goliath. The name was prophetic. The pumpkins did not just grow. They swelled, they expanded, they colonized the ground they sat on. By the end of July, they were the size of water buckets. By the first week of August, Goliath was too heavy for Ilara to turn on her own. The gentle humor of it all was a constant source of delight. These were not merely vegetables. They were absurd, comical, dignified creatures. Finn would lie on his belly and talk to them, his voice a low murmur against their cooling rinds in the evening. They were his flock, his herd. He knew each one by its shape and the unique pattern of its veins. For Ilara, their impossible size was a quiet, booming vindication. She had listened to the land, not to the men who claimed to own it. But vindication did not pay for flour or salt. Her money was nearly gone. The thought of harvesting one of the giants was painful. It felt like dismantling a monument. Instead, she chose 3 smaller, more conventional-looking pumpkins from a less robust vine that had sprung up near the edge of the patch. They were still impressive, each weighing a good 20 pounds, with deep orange flesh. But next to Goliath, they looked like children. She loaded them into her wheelbarrow, covering them with a sack. She wouldn't sell them in Dustfall. She couldn't bear the questions yet. The shift from mockery to a greedy, prying curiosity. The secret was not yet ready for the light. She would go to Concord, the next town over, where she was just a stranger with a wheelbarrow full of pumpkins. The success was still private, a quiet joy she and Finn held between them, and she was not yet ready to share it with the world that had been so certain of her failure. The 10-mile walk to Concord was grueling. The sun beat down, and the dirt road threw up a fine powder that coated her clothes and stung her eyes. The wheelbarrow, laden with 60 pounds of pumpkin, seemed determined to find every rut and rock. But with every push, Ilara felt a growing sense of purpose. This was the first fruit of her labor, the first tangible proof that could be exchanged for the necessities of life. Concord was a larger, more prosperous town than Dustfall, with a proper main street and glass-fronted shops. She found the bakery easily by its smell, a warm cloud of yeast and sugar that was the scent of civilization itself. The baker was a stout man with flour in his eyebrows and a permanently skeptical expression. His name, painted on the window, was E. Abernathy. He glanced at her dusty appearance and the lumpy sack in her wheelbarrow with disinterest. "If you're begging, the church is 2 blocks down," he said without preamble. "I'm not begging," Ilara replied, her voice steady. "I'm selling." She pulled back the sack. The 3 pumpkins sat there, their color vibrant even in the dusty street. Mr. Abernathy's skepticism flickered, but did not die. "Pumpkins? In this drought? They're early." "They are," she agreed. He came out from behind his counter, wiping his hands on his apron. He picked one up, testing its weight. He grunted. It was heavier than it looked. "Where'd you get them?" "I grew them." "Where?" "Over near Dustfall." He snorted. "Nothing good grows near Dustfall, especially not this year. The soil's played out." It was the same story, the same tired verdict. Ilara said nothing. She waited. Her stillness was a challenge. Impatiently, he took the pumpkin inside. "A thing's only worth what's inside it," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He placed it on a massive butcher block and, with a large knife, split it in 2. The sound was a dull, satisfying thud, and then there was silence. The inside of the pumpkin was a revelation. The flesh was a startlingly deep, fiery orange, thick and dense. A sweet, nutty aroma filled the shop, overwhelming the scent of bread. There were very few seeds, clustered in a small pocket at the center. It was almost entirely meat. Mr. Abernathy stared. He had been baking pumpkin pies for 30 years, and he had never seen anything like it. He scraped a small sliver of the raw flesh with his thumbnail and tasted it. His eyes widened. It was sweet, not watery or stringy like so many drought-year pumpkins. He could already imagine the pies, the custards, the bread. He could imagine the color, the taste, the customers lining up. He tried to compose his features, to regain his skeptical mask, but the baker in him had already surrendered. "How many more do you have?" he asked. His voice changed. "A few," Ilara said, which was not a lie. "I'll take them," he said immediately. "I'll take whatever you can bring me, every week." He named a price that was more than fair, a price that acknowledged the quality he had just witnessed. When Ilara left the bakery, her wheelbarrow was empty and her coin purse was heavy. The 10-mile walk home felt different. The weight on her shoulders had been replaced by a weight in her pocket. It was the first real money she had earned from the dead land. She did not broadcast her success. When she bought flour and salt and a new blade for her hoe in Dustfall's general store, she paid quietly and left. But money leaves a trail. The storekeeper noticed the new coin. The liveryman who saw her pass on the road to Concord mentioned it to a friend. Whispers began to propagate, different from the ones before. They were no longer whispers of pity, but of curiosity. Where had the mud girl gotten money? Silas Croft heard the whispers, of course. He heard everything in the town that was his personal fiefdom. He dismissed it at first. A woman alone. She must have had a little money saved. But the whispers persisted. He had seen her himself, hauling manure like a hired boy. He had laughed. Now, the laughter soured in his throat. He began to wonder what, exactly, was happening behind that screen of willows. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky turned a pale, hazy white and stayed that way for weeks. The creek, which had been shrinking since July, became a pathetic trickle, a muddy seam in a wide, cracked bed. Dustfall lived up to its name. A fine layer of brown powder settled on everything, a gritty film on the sills of windows and the leaves of the few hardy trees in the town square. The wells grew shallow, and the water brought up was warm and tasted of dirt. For the farmers, it was a catastrophe. Corn, which had promised a meager harvest, now gave up entirely, the stalks bleaching to the color of bone, the ears stunted and empty. Hayfields were brown and brittle. Silas Croft, for all his experience and his prime land, was not immune. He rode through his fields day after day, his face growing harder, the lines around his mouth deepening. The land he had mastered, the soil he knew, was betraying him. His wealth was written in acres of corn and wheat, and that writing was being erased by the sun. He grew short-tempered with his tenants, with the men at the grange, with his wife. The failure was a personal affront. In stark contrast, Ilara's basin was a different world. The deep, rich soil she had built acted like a sponge, holding the dew of the night long into the morning. The massive leaves of the pumpkin vines created a microclimate, a humid, shaded space that defied the kiln-like air outside. The plant's roots, unhindered by hardpan, had driven deep, tapping into the water table that still flowed far beneath the dry surface of the creek. Her pumpkins, sheltered and sustained, continued their inexorable expansion. Goliath was now the size of a small wagon wheel, its orange skin so luminous it seemed to glow in the twilight. Ilara and Finn had to haul water now, bucket by painful bucket, from the deepest pool left in the creek, but their efforts were rewarded. The patch was not just surviving, it was thriving. It was an island of impossible abundance in an ocean of drought. Croft's mockery had long since evaporated, replaced by a gnawing suspicion. The whispers about Ilara's sudden income, coupled with his own mounting losses, created a bitter cocktail of envy and disbelief in his gut. One afternoon, unable to bear the sight of his own rattling corn any longer, he saddled his horse and rode toward the old mill land. He didn't stay on the road. He cut across the parched fields, his horse's hooves kicking up puffs of brown dust. He tethered his horse to a cottonwood and approached the willow screen on foot. He pushed aside the branches and looked into the basin. The sight struck him like a physical blow. He saw the vibrant, almost lurid green of the leaves. He saw the network of thick vines crisscrossing the black earth. And he saw the pumpkins. He saw dozens of them, great orange globes resting on the ground like treasures in a dragon's hoard. He saw Goliath. His mind refused to process it. It was impossible. This was the dead land. This was the poisoned soil. He, Silas Croft, the master of the valley's agriculture, was being ruined, while this girl, was presiding over a miracle. The envy was so sharp it tasted like metal in his mouth. It was not right. It was unnatural. He backed away from the willows, his mind racing. She must be cheating. She must be diverting water, stealing the last dregs of the creek for her own selfish use. That had to be it. The thought took root, a seed of poison in his own mind, and he nurtured it. He would not allow himself to be shamed by a lone woman and her patch of freakish gourds. He would find a way to take it. He rode back to town, the image of the pumpkins burned into his mind. By the time he reached his own front porch, his envy had hardened into a plan. He would not be a victim of this drought. He would be its master. And Alara would be his first lesson to the town. He found her the next day, mending a tear in the wire fence she'd put up to keep deer out. He dismounted, adopting his old mask of paternal concern, but his eyes were hard. "Miss Alara," he began, his voice smooth as oil. "The town is concerned. The creek is all but gone, and yet your garden seems to be flourishing. Some are saying you must have found a way to dam the creek upstream, to divert the last of the water for yourself." It was a lie, but a plausible one. Hunger makes a town suspicious. Alara straightened up, wiping her hands on her trousers. She looked at the pathetic trickle of the creek, then back at him. "There's nothing to dam, Mr. Croft. The water I use, I haul in buckets. The soil holds it." "The soil?" he scoffed, forgetting his concerned act for a moment. "That soil is dead." "You keep saying that," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the first time she had directly contradicted him, and it threw him off balance. He recovered quickly. "Be that as it may," he said, shifting his approach. "A crop like that, in a year like this, it's a risk. A single hailstorm, an early frost, and you'd lose everything. You're one person alone. It's too much to manage." He let that hang in the air before delivering the point of his attack. "I feel a civic duty to help you. I'll make you an offer. I'll buy the whole crop, as it sits. Take it off your hands, spare you the risk of the harvest. I'll give you a fair price, $50, for everything." It was a pittance. Goliath alone was worth more than that to a man like Abernathy. $50 was the price of his contempt. He expected her to be grateful, or at least to bargain. He did not expect her to simply shake her head. "No thank you, Mr. Croft. They're not for sale." His face tightened. "That's a foolish decision. You'll regret it when you're left with a field of rotten pumpkins." "That's my risk to take," she said. She turned back to her fence, the conversation for her clearly over. His smoothly managed condescension curdled into open anger. "You'll find this town has a long memory for those who don't contribute to the common good," he spat and rode away. His threats were not idle. He began to whisper in the right ears. He told the men at the grange that she was a water thief. He told the women at the church that her pumpkins were unnatural, grown in poisoned soil and likely unhealthy. He used his influence on the town council to suggest a survey of all water rights along the creek, a survey aimed squarely at her. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The town, frightened by the drought and primed by years of laughing at her, began to listen. The tide of opinion, which had been slowly turning toward awe, was pulled back toward suspicion. One night, a week later, Alara was woken by a sound from the patch, a scraping, tearing noise. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from her hearth and crept outside. Finn, who had taken to sleeping in a small lean-to near the basin to act as a guard, was already there. In the moonlight, they saw two figures in the patch, trying to smash one of the smaller pumpkins with a fence post. Finn let out a furious yell and hurled a rock. Alara ran toward them, brandishing the poker. The men, startled and clumsy, scrambled away into the darkness. They got away, but not before one of them tripped and cursed, his voice familiar. It was one of Croft's hired hands. The next day in town, Croft approached her again, his face a mask of sympathy. "I heard you had some trouble last night," he said. "Vandals." A terrible shame. You see, it's too much for you to protect. You lost 3 good pumpkins, I hear." Alara froze. They had damaged one. They had not taken any. "How did you know the count?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. A flicker of panic crossed his face before he smoothed it over. "Just the word going around town," he said quickly. But it was too late. He had revealed his hand. He hadn't just heard about the attack. He had received a report. The drought did not break. September came, and with it, the cool nights that signaled the end of summer. But there was no rain. The last of the town's kitchen gardens withered and died. The shallow wells ran completely dry. For the first time in memory, real hunger began to stalk the edges of Dustfall. People's faces grew thinner, their tempers shorter. And all the while, Silas Croft's granaries remained full, the doors securely locked. He was waiting. The price of flour had already doubled, and he knew it would double again. He was a man who understood the arithmetic of desperation. His moment of maximum profit was approaching. It was this desperation that finally drove the townsfolk to the one place where there was abundance. They came to Alara's land not with mockery or suspicion, but with a quiet, hollow-eyed shame. The blacksmith, the man who had laughed the loudest, was one of the first. He stood at the edge of her property, his hat in his hands, not daring to come closer. "Miss," he called out, his voice hoarse. "My wife, the children. We have nothing left from the garden. I was wondering if I could buy one of those pumpkins." He couldn't meet her eyes. He was remembering every joke, every dismissive wave of his hand. This was her moment of triumph. She held all the cards. She had the only fresh food for 50 miles. She could name any price. She could charge what Croft was charging for his flour, and they would pay it. She could hoard her harvest and watch the town that had scorned her grovel. She could have her revenge, served cold and satisfying. She looked at the blacksmith's worn face, at the genuine fear in his eyes. She looked past him, toward the town, and imagined the other families, the other children. She thought of Finn, whose loyalty had been so freely given. She walked over to the man, wiping the dirt from her hands. "A big one or a small one?" she asked gently. He flinched, expecting the blow of an extortionate price. I only have a few dollars." "The big ones are $2, she said. "The smaller ones are $1. The blacksmith stared at her. It was a fair price. It was more than fair. It was the price they would have been in a normal year, a year of plenty. It was a price that spoke not of profit, but of decency. "And if you don't have $1, Alara added quietly, "I need my fence extended. A day's work for a pumpkin." The man's shoulders, which had been hunched in shame, straightened. He was being offered a trade, not charity. It was a gift of dignity, and it was worth more than any pumpkin. "I have the $1, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll fix your fence tomorrow, for free." He was the first. Others followed. A trickle, then a steady stream of her former mockers, all coming to her with the same downcast eyes and hopeful questions. To each, she gave the same answer: a fair price for those who could pay, honest work for those who could not. She gave one of the medium-sized pumpkins to Finn's family outright, a gift that brought tears to his mother's eyes. She was not just selling food. She was feeding a community. She was choosing generosity over greed, and in that choice she found a victory far more profound than simple vindication. Her quiet acts of fairness were a louder rebuke to Silas Croft than any accusation could ever be. He was hoarding his wealth while she was sharing hers, and the town was taking notice. The town's gratitude was a quiet, powerful force. But Silas Croft's fury was a loud one. Ilara's fair prices were an anchor, keeping the town's desperation from spiraling to the point where they would meet his exorbitant demands for flour. She was not just feeding people, she was interfering with his profits. His hatred for her, once a simple matter of envy, now became a cold, calculated obsession. If he couldn't buy her out or scare her off, he would use the law to crush her. He was the chairman of the town council, a position that came with influence over the county assessor and the sheriff. He spent 2 days poring over old ledgers and maps, and he found what he was looking for: a forgotten, unpaid tax lien on the mill property from 20 years prior. It was a technicality, a clerical error, but in the hands of a man like Croft, it could become a weapon. He called a town meeting. The official purpose was to discuss the drought, but everyone knew its real target was Ilara. The meeting was held in the Grange Hall, the air thick with tension. Croft stood at the front, a sheaf of papers in his hand, the very picture of civic authority. Ilara sat in the front row, Finn at her side. She had not been summoned, but she had come. She would not let her fate be decided in her absence. Croft began by speaking of the hardships, of the common good, of the need for shared sacrifice. His words were hollow, and everyone knew it. Then he turned his attack on Ilara. He presented the tax lien, a dusty document full of legal jargon. He explained, with feigned regret, that the land had a debt against it, a debt that, with interest, now amounted to a significant sum. "It is with a heavy heart," he said, his voice oozing false sorrow, "that the council must move to reclaim this property for the good of the town, to be sold to settle this long overdue debt." It was a legal, public hanging. Ilara would be stripped of her land, her home, and her harvest. Croft would then, of course, offer to buy the land from the county himself for a pittance. He would get the pumpkins after all. A murmur of protest went through the crowd. 2 weeks ago they might have cheered. Now they were the ones with Ilara's pumpkin flesh in their pantries. But Croft had the law on his side. It seemed hopeless. Then the blacksmith stood up. "That ain't right, Silas," he said, his voice booming in the quiet hall. "That woman fed my children when you would have let them starve." A woman from the back called out, "She asked for a day's work, not my last dollar." One by one, they stood. The people she had helped. The proud, frightened neighbors whose hunger she had met with kindness. It was a chorus of defiance. Croft's face darkened. "This is a matter of law, not sentiment," he shouted, his composure cracking. Just then, the back door of the hall opened. A man stepped in, dusting off his hat. It was Mr. Abernathy, the baker from Concord. "Pardon the interruption," he said, striding to the front, "but I heard there was some question about the value of this land." He turned to the crowd. "I am a baker. I know produce, and I can tell you that the pumpkins grown by this woman are the finest I have seen in 30 years. I have a standing contract with her that will more than cover any back taxes you can invent." He looked directly at Croft. "And any attempt to interfere with that contract will be met by my lawyers." Croft was reeling, but he wasn't beaten. "This is not about pumpkins. It is about a flagrant disregard for our town's laws." It was Finn who delivered the final blow. He stood up, his small voice trembling but clear. "He's a liar," he said, pointing a finger at Croft. "He tried to pay me. He offered me a silver dollar to go into the patch at night and cut the vines. He said it would teach her a lesson." The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to Croft. "That's a ridiculous accusation from a child," he blustered. "How would you even know how many vines there are?" Finn asked, his voice gaining strength. "You told me to cut the big one, Goliath, and the 10 vines closest to it." Croft froze. His face went pale. In his rage, in his instructions to the boy, he had revealed a knowledge he could only have if he'd been there, spying, counting, plotting. It was the same mistake he'd made before, after the vandalism. It was the arrogance of a man who believed he was too smart to be caught. He had been caught. The silence in the hall was his verdict. He had been exposed, not by a lawyer, but by the simple, honest words of a child. The defeat of Silas Croft was total and absolute. He did not speak again at the meeting. He gathered his papers and walked out of the Grange Hall, the crowd parting before him in a silence that was more damning than any jeer. His power, built on years of intimidation and the illusion of wisdom, had crumbled in an instant. He had been shamed by his own greed, in front of the community he thought he controlled. He began hoarding grain, but the town, united by a new sense of purpose, organized. Mr. Abernathy helped arrange a shipment of flour from a miller in Concord, breaking Croft's monopoly. The men of the town, led by the blacksmith, took turns standing watch over Alara's property, not just to protect her harvest, but as a statement of allegiance. She was no longer an outsider. She was one of them. The drought finally broke in late September, with a long, soaking rain that felt like a baptism. The creek began to run again, and the land drank deeply. When the day of the Harvest Festival came, it was not a hollow affair, but a true celebration of survival and community. The centerpiece, displayed on a platform in the middle of the town square, was Goliath, flanked by a dozen of its brethren. They were a testament not just to a remarkable harvest, but to a change of heart. People touched the giant pumpkins with a sort of reverence. They were a symbol of the fact that something beautiful and nourishing could come from a place everyone had given up on. Alara, standing beside Old Man Hemlock near the edge of the festivities, watched as Finn showed other children the pumpkin he had named. She was no longer the mud girl, the manure girl, the fool. She was the woman who had fed them. She had proven her point not with arguments, but with action. She had met scorn with patience and desperation with generosity. Hemlock watched her, a rare, faint smile on his weathered face. He gestured with his chin toward the rich, dark soil of her basin, now being prepared for a winter cover crop by men who had once mocked her. "You see," he said, his voice a quiet rasp against the cheerful noise of the festival. "The land does not forget what it is. It only remembers what you teach it." Alara nodded. She looked at the faces of the townspeople, at the children laughing, at the tables laden with food, much of it made from her pumpkins. She was secure now. She was respected. But more than that, she was connected. The lonely arithmetic of her first year had been replaced by a new equation, one of shared labor and shared reward. She was not one person alone. She was part of a place that was, like her soil, slowly, surely, coming back to life. Later that evening, after the crowds had gone home, she walked back to her basin. The moon was high, casting a silver light over the harvested field. She knelt down and plunged her hands into the soil she had made. It was cool, moist, and alive. It smelled of rain and leaf mold and all the autumns yet to come. It was not a graveyard. It was a cradle. And she, who had arrived with nothing but a secret in a wooden box, had finally found her home.